Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 2nd of August. Today we're looking at a trifecta of the front line, looking at the Vuhledar front, sort of also around Konstantinivka. We're looking at the Pokrovsk direction and finishing off with the suburbs of Toretsk. A lot of really important updates, beginning with the Russian forces advancing 1.5 kilometers in the northwestern direction. You could see that marked here with this yellow polygon. The Russian forces being able to cut off the 00532 highway that connects between two really important frontline defense nodes for the Ukrainians. You could see them on the map, Konstantinivka and Vuhledar over here. They are no longer connected by this route that I have marked with these two lines here. And so how can the Ukrainians connect between them? Because these are really important nodes, and eventually there's going to be some sort of swap of forces or equipment, and of course you want to communicate with one another. And a lot of that was done through this road, even when the Russians were knocking on the doorstep of this road for weeks upon weeks, able to fire directly towards it with ATGMs or just moving artillery closer to it. The Ukrainians still were steadfast in their utilization of this route because it is a paved route, which is very important. And it's one that is really one of the few that the Ukrainians actually have at their disposal. Because if you look at the alternatives, they really are all through open fields. And so now the Ukrainians, if they're going to want to move any sort of force from one place to another, it's going to have to be done through these open areas. And there are vast swaths of open fields in this region. That is not really the issue. It's just the fact that if you're moving heavier equipment, then it's going to be more difficult to do that through some of these fields than it would be along the paved road. And then again, the Russians are now going to be scouring these open fields to begin just targeting the Ukrainian equipment, whatever it may be, one by one. In terms of actual paved routes that can be used, because if you're looking on a smaller level, then utilizing fields isn't that big of a deal. But when you're scaling that out to several brigades and everything that comes with that, everything that comes from the brigade headquarters, and you're doing that over a period of weeks or months, then yeah, it does become an issue when you don't have a singular paved road at your disposal. And so if we're looking for that sort of solution, then it would have to be through making this massive U-turn all the way up to Uspanivska, then to Bohoyaldevneka, whatever it's called, and then all the way south to Vuhledar. And so that's simply not feasible. That's way too long. And so the Ukrainians will be utilizing the open fields where they will be, of course, still susceptible to Russian frontline harassment. Now, in terms of the Russian advance and where it's occurring through, I think that they advanced here specifically because there was an opening in the front line, a gap, and they wanted to physically reach the road in order to just make it inaccessible to the Ukrainians beyond a shadow of a doubt. But when you look at the elevation, the area where the Russians advanced is actually the lowest lying region in this entire theater. And so let's actually measure it with these red parallel lines to show the valley in the region. It also sort of makes sense when you're looking at some of the ponds and how it's rather close to some of the river valleys in this area. And so you could see how there is this sort of depression that extends out of the yellow polygon and then actually makes its way even further westwards all the way through this area over here. It's meandering along this sort of stretched out X shape. And the area where the Russians advance through, to the north, there is a hill. This hill sort of fizzles out by the time that you reach Konstantinivka's southern flank around here. But in the areas preceding it to the east, it really is a massive height that the Russians were able to secure. And it's the reason why they advanced through Novomikhailivka. And now it just largely overlooks the vector of the Russian advance. And the Ukrainians don't really have any sort of ability to utilize those hills to overlook the Russians, because whatever they do control at this point in time, which would be this area over here just south of Konstantinivka, it is just so close to ground zero that it can't be used at a large scale, as we said before. In terms of other heights in the region, we do know there is a massive ridge that basically runs along these two parallel lines. And so in the area where it's under Russian control, the Russians have that advantage, and then vice versa. And it extends into Vodiane, which is important to note. Vodiane is on a really high elevation. Vuhledar itself also includes a lot of structures now within the populated regions, but just nearby you have, for instance, here these quarries and the actual mine itself. Those are large structures, and you have another coal mine over here, and those, of course, are being utilized by the Ukrainians turned into really strong defense nodes on their own that have to be sort of disposed of by the Russians. And so the Ukrainians do have, to a certain extent, an elevation advantage when it comes to an area like Vodiane. And that's why the Russians are interested in taking it over. But for now, the immediate goal is to basically hamper Ukraine's logistics situation, solidify control of the areas east of the road, and then begin to continue advancing along ridges. For instance, just north of Vodiane, that's an area where the Russians can begin flanking that populated region, and then also utilizing the sort of momentum that was gained by taking control of the Cielo polygon to begin the sort of harassment operations and actually probing into the southern outskirts of Kostantinivka, because we know for the most part the Russians have been attacking from the southeastern direction from Novomikhailivka. They've been able to gain a foothold in some houses, but it's not been really enough to leave a large mark. And so now the Russians do largely have control over that southern perimeter, which will allow them to broaden their horizons and attack at different parts of the village. And so it is important to keep an eye out for this front line. I will, of course, be talking in more detail about the implications and looking at the actual topographic map in additional videos. And I'm going to be doing the same thing, replicating that for a lot of these key parts of the front line where we are continuing to see Russian momentum. An area where we're seeing the most of that is in the Pokrovsk direction. You can see if we're measuring it right now, and I'm going to continue doing this until the Russians eventually do reach the outskirts. But the Russians are about 12 kilometers away from Mirnohrad, and they are 17 kilometers from Pokrovsk. Again, Russians every day steadily getting closer to the point where they can move into short-range artillery to a rather comfortable position on a hill, not too close to the front line, and then begin to consistently fire towards the center of some of these key cities. If we're zooming in, looking at yellow, these are the regions that the Russians advanced through in the past 24 hours. This includes a 1.5 square kilometer region south of Vovche, likely being led by the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade. They've been heavily involved in the capture of Vovche and advances south. They've been able to capture this really important strong point, because basically every single strong point at this point, if you're looking at it, it's a means by which the Ukrainians can protract the fighting and just buy enough time for reinforcements and new equipment to come to a nearby village. And so it is important for the Russians to overrun it quickly and then utilize those flanks to begin putting pressure on various parts of the perimeters of these villages. And so now with the capture of this sort of polygon that you see in yellow, an advance amounting to 1.7 kilometers, the Russians do have an open route to begin one by one going through these smaller structures, these smaller fortifications that were built in order to defend against horizontal attacks from the eastern bank of the river. They can now flank them from the north, and they're doing so as they control the higher elevated parts of this front line. Because if you're looking at this red rectangle, these are all hills, and the Russians are now going to begin pushing through that region. Of course, some of the trenches are also on those same heights, and so sometimes there will be a parity. In other cases, for instance, in Mezhove, it is on really low elevation as it is within the river valley. Same thing for Skuchnia, same thing for a lot of these sort of open fields in between the trenches. And so the Russians will have the opportunity to overlook all of that river valley region. And regardless of the elevation, they're just flanking it from the north, which is going to be a really bad situation because you have the Russian pressure coming from the east, not as much, and then the flanking from the north where there is significant momentum. And then at the same time, the Russians are also looking towards Jelane, and you can see they're doing that through sort of three axes right now. The first one is from this northeastern direction where the Russians do have the hills that we talked about that overlook Jelane, which is on really low elevation. Then you have this extension from the rail bank, from the embankment, where you did have DRG operators push through yesterday. And now they've been able to basically reach this junction over here, really, really close to actually infiltrating inside. Maybe while I'm speaking, you already do have these Russian sort of sabotage forces within the village trying to pin down Ukrainian forces and degrade them before the large assaults begin onto the village. We saw that occur in several nearby settlements. And then you have this really interesting sort of advance by the Russians, which amounts to about 1.1 kilometers southwestwards. The Russians, despite the fact that it does look thin on the map in terms of the sort of salient that is being formed by the Russians, when you're looking at it in practical terms, the Ukrainians simply don't have the wherewithal, even though they have a lot of units on paper here, they don't have the wherewithal to organize concerted efforts to flank and then cut off the Russian advances along the rail embankment. That does not mean that the Russians are not concerned with their flanks. They definitely are, because they are attacking in Zhelane and maybe will in Serhivka soon. But it means they are able to afford to take more risks with how far they and how deep they advance along this rail axis, even if it is along just two narrow windbreaks that entire period, because you're not getting that much pushback if you're a Russian soldier on the ground. You're getting artillery strikes and FPV strikes, which are leading to casualties, but that happens anywhere when you're near the front line. And so the Russians are able to then take advantage of the benefits of that, basically being present on a higher embankment and overlooking Jelane from the west. So now it's being attacked and overlooked from three directions, which is really bad predicament. You do have, of course, 47th Brigade partially defending here, along with some other units, special force units, may be operating generally in this region. But since there's been a really hectic withdrawal by the Ukrainians west of the river, we haven't gotten a full breakdown of where each specific unit is now operating. A lot of it may be split. A lot of companies may be in one region and aren't actually working together, which just makes it harder to coordinate setting up a solid defense line. And you could see that with how the Russians were able to form a wedge in between two populated areas where you would expect a lot of the reinforcements to be sent towards. And now the Russians have the opportunity to flank Serhivka from the south, as they're also advancing directly horizontally from the east, where the Russian forces have advanced about 650 square kilometers, or meters, sorry. And you could see that they were able to gain this polygon here, which amounts to 2.3 square kilometers. So it is a rather large swath of fields, and it includes the Russian capture of Vesele in its entirety. And I was talking about yesterday how the Russians, it was really only a matter of days before they captured it, and they captured it the next day. And that's because Vesele, once the Russians entered it, it was just a foregone conclusion, because just to the southeast, the Russians have the rail embankment. Vesele is just really isolated from nearby Ukrainian villages. It's on a valley. It's already just being pounded by the Russians. And so there was no way for the Ukrainians to hold on to such a small strip of land like that. So the Russians are now able to advance. They gained about 900 meters in the northwestern direction. And if we're measuring it out right now, this is a really important issue to discuss. The Russians are only about 2 kilometers away from Hordivka, and there's nothing in between them. There's no large defensive structures to my knowledge, and there isn't a populated area in between. And so Hordivka, because of how massive it is in comparison to these other villages, it can't be just entirely taken through one attack vector, but you could draw in a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements that would have been sent to contain the advances further south or along the rail bank to go and help in defending Hordivka. And then that also puts them in this really uncomfortable position where they're engaged once again in this sort of urban battle that's drawn out. And the Russians right now having the momentum and also receiving their own reinforcements, they may be in the ability to take that sort of risk in terms of increasing their casualty counts in order to quickly get control over a populated area like this. Because Hordivka, if we're measuring it out just directly, it's only about 8 kilometers away from Mirnohrad. It is located on a valley if we're looking at it. Northwards over here around the Toretsk River region, really all of this region is on low elevation because you do have all of these tributaries staking out from the river. And so everything here is just a low elevation. Further south, though, you do have a rather open field region sort of thing, and it extends out of the rail embankment. And that area is on a hill that overlooks Hordivka. The Russian forces are now getting close to capturing that field, and that would be a really big blow, because then the Russians would just have free reign from the south, and then there would actually be a big concern for the Ukrainian defenders here. And at that point, it would be not just an issue for Hordivka, but it would be way bigger implications for the entirety of the Ukrainian defensive structure in this general theater towards Pokrovsk, whether it be in Selidove, in Ukrainsk, any sort of holdings that are located west of the Vavcha River would be compromised with a Russian salient that occurred in Hordivka. Not to say that there would be any sort of massive collapse. I don't believe that, but it would really be a big thorn in the nail of the Ukrainians, in their backs, which they were not expecting to occur at this sort of pace. If you're looking a bit eastwards here, this gain is about nearly 4 square kilometers. The Russian forces getting control over the entirety of the hills that are southeast of Ivanivka. Now the Russians have the perfect entrance through these forested regions and through this main road into the village itself. And so, again, the Russians are already in the process of taking it over and could over the next few days. You do have some elements of the 47th Brigade defending here, and the goal at least was to try to maintain a solid line temporarily from Ivanivka to Timofivka. But the Russians were able to capture Timofivka yesterday, and now you can see that it's been relegated to this sort of line between Ivanivka and Lysychnya, which is a really small hamlet, which the Russians are really close to capturing. And Ivanivka is the largest village in this region. The loss of Ivanivka would really embolden the Russians on this sort of eastern direction because they would have really free reign and also have cover. They would be able to cover their advances along this road by using the hills that they have been able to capture so far, and then utilize this paved route to actually reach Rodivka itself. And that would all be emboldened by the capture of the nearby settlement of Ivanivka. If we're looking northwards at Timofivka, the Russians are not stopping. They do want to actually take over Lysychnya, and then that would sort of force Ukraine's hand in Ivanivka and in nearby villages that are along the Toretsk River. In terms of the gain, the Russians got control over this rather small piece of territory, expanding from Timofivka about 700 meters in the southwestern direction. And let me reiterate that elevation really is a huge issue for the Ukrainians here. The Russians really are forcing Ukraine's hand every step of the way by advancing through ridges and hills, and then forcing the Ukrainians into these sort of semicircles, not always, but also just attacking from multiple axes, and then creating these very uncomfortable situations where the Ukrainian command has to deliberate whether to hold on and risk encirclement like happened around Pokrovsk, or just continue to hold on and then eventually withdraw, and then that cedes the land to the Russians, including fortified areas and defensive nodes. And so the Russians really have been trying to create a lot of these sort of mini cauldrons. They're being done by means of sending in infantry first, DRG squads through tree lines to try to establish a perimeter, establish solid bases, then sending in the motorcyclists to dismount and get there quickly, and then through larger scale assaults with a lot of armored forces because, again, the Russian tank regiments in this region really are active. A lot of them operated previously around Orlivka and are probably now being moved northwards to their Cheratina area to become their new sort of frontline bases. And so if we're zooming in, we do have a lot of those sort of tank regiments around here. I really hope I can show you just one example if I could find one and identify it. But more generally, the Russian forces have been moving in reinforcements, mainly from the 27th Motor Rifle Division, which is really present around here. You also have the 6th Motor Rifle Division and their 10th Tank Regiment, which is engaging with Ukrainian forces in this region. But I've said this before, 27th Division, it has 3 Motor Rifle Regiments that are now actively participating west of the riverbank. And so what this means is that it's probably between 3 to 6,000 if we're talking about the size of a Russian regiment. And they're all committed to this part of the front line. So that's important to note in terms of the size of the Russian sort of frontline activities. But you also do have some assault brigades around here and territorial defense forces that have been active since the Avdiivka days. And because the Russians do actually have depth here, some older forces, some newer ones, some DPR forces, some sort of tank forces, and several divisions that are all unified and are actually all in their entirety operating here, there is more flexibility for the Russians in terms of which units they're actually utilizing in this part of the front line. And so now it's mainly going to be down to the 15th Brigade, but also the 27th Division. Here we have a geolocation from August 2nd showing a Ukrainian FPV strike south of Volche. It showed that there was a strike on what either was a Russian infantry fighting vehicle or a Ukrainian Bradley that was abandoned, and the Ukrainians didn't want the Russians to take it as a trophy. Either way, it sort of goes hand in hand with the reporting from Ukrainian sources of this Russian advance over here. And lastly, moving on to the suburbs of Toretsk, we're zooming in on Zalizhnya, where the Russian forces, once they made that initial exploitation and were able to advance deeper and deeper into Zalizhnya towards this diagonal road, there was simply no means by which the Ukrainians could have held them back at that point. There was simply too much Russian momentum, and there aren't enough fortified positions for the Ukrainians in this region. There are a lot of forested areas, and yes, there are houses, although they are not as dense and compact as you should imagine from an urban area, because this is sort of the suburb region. And so the Russians were able to take advantage of that and just go hopping from house to house rather quickly and it appears the Ukrainians did not have the volume of men needed to counteract that, because whatever men they did have here, a lot of them were diverted to New York. A lot of them were needed to hold the line around Druzhba Pivnishnya, which they've done so far. A lot of them need to contain advances just a couple of hundred meters northwards. And so eventually it depletes the force in a key area like Zalizhnya. And if the Russian forces put in all of their cards into that one region and just continue pushing through, then there's not much the Ukrainians could do at the immediate moment when that happens. But I do imagine that the Ukrainians will be moving in local companies and maybe battalions into this region to try to solidify the line, prevent the Russians from taking over really the crown jewel of this region, which is Slakeep. It's still under Ukrainian control to our knowledge, but we do know that the main unit defending in this region is the Voron unit from the 100th Mechanized Brigade. More generally, the brigade is over here, but we're seeing a lot of videos from its drone element when it comes to striking individual Russian soldiers in the houses in which they're located. So they released a compilation today which shows really significant gains by the Russians. Here you could see that the FPV strikes occurred in southwestern Zalizhnya. In terms of the extent of the gain, the Russians were able to push about 700 meters in the southwestern direction, taking over this piece of land, maybe even more, but I'm leaving the other sort of streets over here, private residential houses, as a gray zone until confirmed that the Russians took them. What this means is that now the Russians have been able to create a spearhead that essentially reaches the southern tip of the suburb, and that means between the Russian line of contact in New York, there is nothing separating it besides these trenches over here. And it means that the Russians are only about 4.3 kilometers away from sort of sealing the lid on this really significant salient, which includes so many trenches, so many houses as well from New York. And the situation is really becoming difficult for the defenders here. They could still rotate because it is still pretty wide, but there aren't as many paved roads anymore, and any sort of movement is detected by the Russians and could be fired upon accordingly. It doesn't always hit them, but in a lot of cases it is very risky to get out of the trenches and try to rotate in and out and move in resupply. And so it is becoming very difficult for the defenses here. But the reason why they're holding is pretty clear, and we've seen this with so many other Ukrainian salients. They really are just trying to milk it for as long as possible in this region, trying to utilize their defenses that were built over the course of 10 years in order to bog down the Russians with actual static defenses, but also mines and FPVs targeting any sort of movement of Russian soldiers. And the goal is to just buy enough time to sort of strengthen the northern bank of the New York defense system in order to prevent that from falling as well. Because eventually, if the salient were to fall, then it would look something like this. And that would be really dangerous for the entirety of New York. And so the Ukrainians really do want to prepare to send in new reinforcements and build in additional lines, even past New York. They're trying to look to a post-New York future where the southern flank of Toretsk is more protected. Then looking a bit north, we can see the Russian forces were able to advance, let's see, in the direction of the Slakeep about 200 meters, and then in this sort of northeastern direction about 600 meters. You can see that the gains are still pretty small, but they are significant because we're seeing the Russian strip of land that is past the diagonal road is broadening. You can see based on geolocations that there are Russian forces in new districts that are west of that road, which means that the Ukrainian impromptu defense line has been broken in this region. And it really has been broken before it could have even been fully set into stone as a defense line. What this means is that the northern flank of the Slakeep is now compromised, as well as a lot of nearby structures. There were some waterworks facilities here and factories. There's also another Slakeep nearby, which the Ukrainians could fall back to if they're pushed back. And by that point, you're already reaching the actual outskirts of Toretsk. And looking at the sort of gain made by the Russians, they were able to capture a few key buildings, duplexes, hospital, some schools are in the area. There's a lyceum. And generally, there are some industrial projects that are currently in the gray zone. And so the Russians are now pushing through this new area. And what this could manifest as is also a sort of strong southern flank pushing through this forested region towards the southern parts of the other Slakeep in the region, which the Russians are also very close to arriving at. Not to taking over, but to arriving at least, which is going to make it difficult for the Ukrainians to use it more effectively if it's just so close to the front line that you have to fight over it all the time. And so you could see how rather quickly the Russian forces have been able to sort of flip the switch and actually undermine the Ukrainian sort of speculative defense line, and now it cannot be used to extend the fighting east of Toretsk for an extended period of time. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.